Good morning and welcome to the i3 webinar with Aviva Investors, where I'm honored to host Steve Waygood, the Chief Responsible Investment Officer. I'm a Tech 10 with i3, and we'll be addressing the very important topic of achieving net zero targets and a roadmap for institutional investors. Now, before we get into today's topic and the discussion, here's a video to start this session, so enjoy.
The value we place on a stable natural world will ultimately determine its future. Do we invest money in the practices that take us deeper into this crisis, or in the solutions that could get us out of it?
The problem with climate change is that it's not a quarterly issue, it's a quarter-century issue.
There's over 300 trillion in the global capital markets, and that money can be harnessed to do a great deal of good.
The biggest risk is inaction today.
This is the most well-educated and the most well-paid industry, and I'll be disappointed if we cannot change ourselves.
Welcome back and welcome Steve this morning or this evening, your time. For the audience, the video, as you can see, starring David Attenborough, Mark Carney, and our very own Steve Waygood here, amongst others, is available on Netflix. So for those of us who have been around, in fact, the world of ESG and sustainability, Steve is certainly no stranger. But for the rest of us, I just like to highlight a bit of Steve's background. So Steve leads the Aviva Investors Global Responsible Investment Team, which achieved an A+ ranking in governance and strategy from the UN Principles for Responsible Investment, a Tier 1 assessment for stewardship from the UK Financial Reporting Council, and in fact won the Responsible Investment Thought Leader and Innovator of the Year Global Award in 2017. In fact, I might add that Steve was part of the expert group that wrote the UN PRI into existence years ago. Steve was recently appointed to the European Commission high-level expert group on sustainable finance and the UK Green Finance Task Force. He's also a member of the Financial Stability Board Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, or TCFD, as I think most of you would be familiar. Steve co-founded and now chairs the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark and the World Benchmarking Alliance. He also co-founded the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative and the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Coalition. And last but not least, Steve is certainly a member of the CFA Institute. He holds a PhD in sustainable finance. And I might say, I guess, in his free time, he's a visiting professor of sustainable finance at the CAS Business School. So Steve, welcome again.
Thank you for having me, Tech. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a really kind introduction there, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And what I do is just as an overview for our audience, the issues we'll be covering today. So in a nutshell, look, governments, institutions, are formally committing or doing more to legislate or to set net zero targets in the near future. Certainly, this will have a major impact on economies and markets. So in the next 40 or so minutes in the fireside chat with myself and Steve, we'll cover the current landscape, impending challenges, the quest for net zero, development of a comprehensive plan, how we can get started, again, for those of us investors in the room who are looking to do that. And for those on the journey, how you can make better progress. Some admin points before we get started. So while I have a list of, in fact, prepared questions, I encourage our audience to submit questions via the question box on this particular app, and we'll endeavor to answer them in the course of the conversation. And a disclaimer here, so this webinar is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute financial advice and is intended for wholesale and institutional investors only. So Steve, let's get started. Look, the main thrust of the discussion here is on the journey to net zero, and that's what most of the audience, the institutional investors, are concerned here. If you could allow me to be a bit cheeky here to start, I'd like to start with a complaint No, not against you, not to worry. Now, some of us are confused by the number of organizations, standards, climate action working groups, now all working to do good towards similar sustainable goals. As a trustee once said to me, it's confusing and unnecessarily complex. Look, other than your day job at Aviva Investors, you've been involved in a number of groups, government ones, COP26 in Glasgow, later on, European Commission and the like. Can you help us, at a high level, can you help us unpack this so-called alphabet soup of different groups that's operating in this area? Steve?
Tech, that is a very good question. I'll do my best to unpack it for you. I think the first thing to say is that we should welcome everyone taking initiative. And the second thing is that we shouldn't try and understand what everyone's doing all the time. It's impossible. There are now so many people working in this space, and that's a good thing, right? There are so many people working here trying to take action, trying to make a difference. The proliferation of different things that they're doing is just almost impossible to comprehend. And I don't think it's necessary to comprehend. The ones that really matter inevitably bubble up to the top. So everyone, I'm sure, on this call will have heard of the UN Principles for Responsible Investment. Just being part of that will bring you to the initiatives that matter. As you said in the introduction, the task force in climate-related financial disclosure, the guidance within it is incredibly important in managing physical risk, transition risk. We're going to talk about that more later, I know. And then the whole concepts of net zero. People don't need to have read the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement or go through the SDGs and the targets and the measures and the goals and try and commit to memory all the principles of the Global Compact, et cetera, et cetera. There are so many initiatives, it is not possible to actually hold them all in your head on time. It's also that there are these initiatives being taken, not by individuals, not just because they want to make a difference, but because it's replacing strong action by global governments, or by multilateral bodies, I should say, and by national governments. And I think we're seeing that change. The likes of the G7, G20, the COP26 process, that is beginning to take action now, where the governments and the multilateral system has really been rather slow to be able to step forwards. But I think, hopefully, the journey is a fascinating and deeply interesting one for everybody. And don't for a second let the number of initiatives be off-putting. Choose a few and focus on those.
And Steve, in a recent interview, in fact, when we featured you, you made a comment around market failure. And sometimes we talked about, market failure versus market efficiency, and I suppose they're not mutually exclusive. Staying on the topic around, again, the multilaterals, you mentioned there's the OECD, there's the FSB, IOSCO, IFRS, central banks. We also hear about, Biden and the Americans rejoining Paris, China coming up to declare, 2060 targets. So at that high level, you've different governments doing things. And your comment about market governance or market failure, how does that fit at that high level?
So let's define a few terms. So market failure is defined in economics as if the market left to its own devices, left uncorrected, in other words, leads to a suboptimal outcome for society. So market failure underpins every government interaction of any description, be it tax or subsidy, be it a standard or a regulation. They use the concept of market failure to say they have to take action. Monopoly, for example, that's an example of a market failure where they need to take action to make sure there are regulations that ensure monopoly power is not exploited. So climate change is often said to be, and I would agree with this, as the world's biggest market failure. The first person to start really globalizing that phrase was Nick Stern, in the Stern Review back in 2006. And it remains true, despite now so many different policy initiatives. In fact, there is an institution, going back to your first question, the Grantham Institute monitors how many policy initiatives have been taken globally. It's now over 2,000. Despite that, some countries having dozens by themselves, despite that, the market is still failing to optimize social well-being. In other words, the externality of emissions is leading to an environmental cost that's too great. So that's for governments to deal with. Okay, we can't, as market participants, we can't tax, We can't regulate, we can't set standards, we don't set subsidies, we aren't the government. We need to remember and recognize that. We can shape government action in that area, but we can't control it. Macro stewardship, I think, is a really important concept that hopefully we can come back to, but shaping, encouraging those that have their hands on these levers for change to use those levers, that is something we can do, but we can't pull them for them. Now, market inefficiency is often thought of in the other way around. So an efficient market is one, if it's perfectly efficient, all information appears instantaneously in the price. If you believe markets are inefficient, as we do as an active fund manager, then you can exploit that market inefficiency to enhance long-term returns. Market inefficiency is very different to market failure. It's about saying if market failure is stupid governments, market inefficiency almost is stupid investors not being able to assimilate the information fast enough into their valuation. Now, ESG integration is all about exploiting market inefficiency. And I would say macro stewardship is all about correcting market failure. So that's how I would carve the two terms out and separate them. But we have a role in both areas as active managers in terms of how we price securities, and as well as concerned stewards of people's pensions. We should encourage the policymakers with their hands on these levers to use them. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's been very clear. In fact, I think last week or so we read about in was it USA Today, the American papers, where a senior ESG executive who said that Wall Street is all about greenwashing. It's about the governments. We can't do anything. It's about the governments who need to do something. The rest of us or investors is about greenwashing. It's a bit extreme there, but I think your answer comes across as we all have a role there in the entire journey and process.
Yeah, I know people on Wall Street who are engaging with people in Washington to try to encourage the Biden climate finance strategy to be as strong as it can. Let's be honest, until the externality is internalized onto the cash flows of the securities that we're evaluating, then the current trading price won't reflect the full price to the company bears on the environment. So it's about, in the economic jargon, it's about internalizing the externalities, and that is the role of governments. We can price that, we can go ahead of it in how we do our strategic asset allocation and how we position portfolios, but we can't actually set the cost of carbon ourselves. And it's only when the cost of carbon is reflecting its true cost to society and the environment that the company's cost of capital will actually be improved, if you like. It will go down the more sustainable it is, or go up the less sustainable it is. That's how a market should work. In some cases it is. But I believe in capitalism. I believe it's part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution by itself. It needs government to set the rules of the game.
Right. Let's get down into, I guess, again, net zero. And again, just before that, there is the Paris Accord. And as Paris is about keeping global warming to less than 2 or 1.5, I guess, more specifically.
That's right.
So there's Paris and there's net zero, and there is the link. Can you help us understand, is there a link there? How does one move from the other?
Yes. So net zero refers to the amount of carbon dioxide that any institution is emitting versus how much is it removing. And the net should be zero. And it equates to the Paris Agreement. If we get to net zero in carbon dioxide with all countries and all institutions globally, if we get there by 2050, it's simply another way of saying what is already in the Paris Agreement, that we will ideally deliver 1.5 degrees, but certainly less than 2. To be a bit more technical, different greenhouse gases can be around for a little longer, methane, HFCs and so on. There are different durations for each. But broadly speaking, CO2 is the most important, and therefore most countries and companies are focusing on carbon dioxide in their net zero statements. But it's a simpler way, some would argue, not everyone, but it's a simpler way of saying we agree with Paris and we're going to make it our objective.
And the link, skeptics will say, how do you prove the link? Is it science-based?
Sure. So there is an initiative, another set of letters for the alphabeti spaghetti, but the Science Based Targets Initiative, the SBTI, sets out how you should codify your net zero targets. I'm sure a number of the people watching this will have read the pilot that came out in October, which is aimed at financial institutions informing us how to set science-based targets for delivering the Paris Agreement through a net zero approach. A few observations on that SBTI. It's very, very young. So it's going through, as a pilot, it's going through all sorts of birthing pains. So for those people on the call who are finding it kind of new to them, well, it's new to pretty much everybody. No one's been at this science-based targets initiative within finance for more than a decade. So it's all very, very new. It's also incomplete. It's very hard, for example, to know exactly how to go about approaching science-based targets on sovereign debt. Anything other than the nationally determined contributions and the delivery of those doesn't seem to make sense. But if a country has made a legally binding commitment to be net zero as a country by a certain point, does that count? The SBTI hasn't yet said that. They haven't opined yet on whether it does. So the link is science-based, and there is an initiative that helps people draw a direct link. It isn't mandatory, but it is considered good practice. And as an initiative, it's also an initiative by a group of NGOs. It's not yet official sector, but I think it won't be long before it is endorsed in the official sector.
Thank you. So look, there's a plan there. It's for debate, but it's a journey. Let's move to the net zero bit, which I think that's what interests most of the audience. So I guess, is it possible for an institutional investor in portfolios and so on to achieve net zero?
Today, it would be extremely difficult across a broadly invested, large institutional investor, incredibly difficult. In fact, people in the NGO community would say it's impossible. And that's because of the scale. If you look at the removal side of the equation, all of the estimates, the IEA scenarios, as they're called, the International Energy Agency scenarios for what's going on with the future trajectory of emissions, they assume, in order to get to less than 2 degrees, they assume an enormous amount of carbon capture and storage, CCS. That is the reducing of the emissions, that's sucking it out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in the ground, typically in the ground. That kind of, the scale of CCS at the moment is minuscule in comparison to where it would need to be. So you're into, to actually do removal of carbon dioxide at the scale that would be required to be a net zero investor today, you're having to create all sorts of new CCF installations that don't actually exist. So there are also nature-based solutions like peat, owning peat, which sequesters carbon as well naturally, or forests, of course, is probably the easiest to understand. As a forest grows, of course, it takes carbon dioxide and turns it into the carbon in the tree. In the tree itself, it's the stuff of its own structure. So that kind of, the amount of carbon that individual institutional investors would need to own to be able to offset is not available right now across a portfolio which would be so heavily invested in fossil fuels today. We need to transition the businesses that we own towards themselves becoming net zero, as well as also overlaying on top of that a reduction of our own scope 1, 2, and 3.
And again, for the the CIOs and portfolio managers and trustees in the audience, again, when you think about transitioning the current portfolio, pension funds, retirement funds, from the current state to net zero, whether it's 2050 or a particular year in the future, how would you advise them? What sort of framework to put in place? Obviously balancing there's the investment piece and sustainability. So what framework is useful for trustees and investors to think about as they begin this journey?
So there's a detailed answer, and I'll give you a simple one first. The simple answer is to not simply walk away from controversial holdings. I think to transition, we need to encourage all the securities where the issues originate to transition. And if all the shareholders who care and understand this problem simply walk away from those companies that need to be challenged, the companies won't be challenged. So before you vote with your feet, vote with your vote. Use your voice at the AGM, use your ownership of the security. If it's a real asset, of course, there won't be an AGM, but you've got even more influence over the way the business is operating. So use your voice, encourage the company to set its own targets. And if it doesn't, and if it won't set credible science-based targets, transition plans that are based on TCFD reports, then at that point, perhaps over a 3-year period, say to the institution that you'll walk away if they don't. And then obviously it becomes the ultimate sanction rather than a first step. It shouldn't be a badge of honor. The more detailed answer, if you're a trustee or a CIO first starting on this journey, I highly recommend the TCFD guidance itself. It's not, the section that applies to investment is not enormous. It's well worth the 20 minutes read that it would take. I'd also pick up a couple of companies' TCFD reports themselves and start familiarizing yourself with the scale of the challenge. If BP manages to deliver net zero by 2050, as they're aiming to, they will have reduced the emissions that go into the air by more than the UK's whole emissions itself. That gives you a sense of the scope of BP's emissions, the scope 3 particularly. So I think board training, as the TCFD itself starts with the governance, the guiding mind of the business. Think about the board, think about the education and the literacy of it that's required, and then think through whether the existing governance of the institution is sufficient to set and then deliver a net zero strategy. We, for example, found we've done a lot of board training. We've produced now 5 TCFD reports as a business, and we found that the creation of a subgroup, a special governance committee looking at ESG issues across the whole business, all asset classes, all regions, and on both sides of the book from the insurance and investment perspective, we found the creation of a new governance committee that brought those the senior managers from across the business together was a very useful forum. It really focused minds, and it got decisions made and then executed. So as I say, read the guidance that's out there, start thinking about what training is required, and then build the governance of your institution if you think it needs to be built out, but make it clear to the leaders that they do need to take leadership.
So that's that disclosure piece with TCFD, as you mentioned. Often, again, if I could ask you to clarify, there was another 3-letter word that's been thrown around a bit. That's CDP.
Yes.
So I guess CDP is about companies, whereas TCFD is a framework for disclosure.
So see, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about institutions originally stepped in where governments weren't delivering. The Carbon Disclosure Project, which was originally what CDP first stood for, that was created in 2001, and actually by a lot of the people who are still involved in the governance of the institution itself. So it's had a very long shelf life. I'm very proud to say that we hosted the first ever meeting of investors for the CDP back in 2001. So the Carbon Disclosure Project looked at things like the World Resources Institute Greenhouse Gas Reporting Protocol, which talked about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. I know this is complicated, but put simply, it's the emissions you generate, the emissions in your supply chain, and then everything else. And for an investor, that everything else is orders of magnitude more than the energy that we consume. But the CDP targeted the top 5,000 companies, as you say, Tech, and they now have over, I think it's 100 trillion worth of investors supporting their engagement with companies to get the data. Now that took us all the way up to about 2015. So for the first 15 years after CDP was created, they were the main institution getting corporate emissions data out into the public domain, and the likes of Bloomberg still use that data, actually. And indeed, the TCFD group, I sit on that group, as you mentioned earlier, the CDP presented a number of times to us in order to inform what the TCFD guidance should say. We then built upon it, and then CDP took from it and have updated their guidance. So it's not a simple matter to say the CDP is one thing, the TCFD is another. There is a much closer relationship, actually, than might meet the eye. But the short answer for your audience is they don't need to read the CDP guidance. They don't even necessarily need to read the TCFD guidance. They need to read the TCFD reports and produce one themselves. And of course, with Bloomberg bringing in the data and MSCI and other analysts using the same data, I think we should be very grateful to CDP for what they've done to step in where governments hadn't. And I think the future of TCFD will be a mandatory environment where most jurisdictions will ultimately make it mandatory, sort of following where TCFD has led. I expect that to be over the next 5-10 years. Most jurisdictions will have done that.
And I guess when we think about disclosure, I mentioned earlier about greenwashing. In fact, I learned a new term recently. It's called rainbow washing, and that alludes to the 17 SDG goals. When you've got checklists, it's easy to check the box. Is this still prevalent? I mean, how should investors be aware? I mean, is greenwashing still prevalent in the industry today? Definitely.
Sometimes it's inadvertent. People don't realize that they're overstating a claim. Sometimes it's intentional. Sometimes it's just based out of confusion and people don't realize quite the strength of the claim they're making, and it can be it can bring franchise risk. There's very few standards, Tech. There are very few international standards that are set out in this space. There aren't very many policing mechanisms. And so what we've ended up with is the ability for some very large institutions to make some very large claims that go unquestioned. So yes, greenwashing is unfortunately still prevalent, and it requires some expertise and to be able to understand whether it's smoke and mirrors or whether it's genuine. And one quick way, I don't know if you're talking about, for example, a company, one quick way of seeing whether or not the company really gets it is to see if they have to disclose their pay structure, whether ESG metrics appear in their pay structure in some way that seems credible. If it does, it tells you a whole world of other things about the quality of the governance and the board and how operationally convinced they are they'll be able to deliver. But yes, as you say, the rainbow washing is all the colors of the SDGs, the 17 colors.
Yes, I guess start with the compensation report and go from there. You start to see things.
That's right. Follow the money.
And disclosure, I guess, inevitably you talk about risk. I recall Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor, whom I'm sure you know and sit on the same board. He made this famous speech, and he calls it the tragedy of the horizon. I guess he punned on the comments, where he identified sort of three risks. There was transition risk, fiscal risk, and then litigation or liability. I think of these three, transition is probably the most important or crucial. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about, how do you define transition risk, what it is to investors?
I'm going to gently say that it's physical risk that's the most important.
Okay.
If we don't deal with physical risk, then some scenarios, and arguably where we're actually business as usual heading, would lead to such serious economic collapse in certain jurisdictions that certain forms of civilization could be tested. So that physical risk, but we're talking about the end of the century, Tech. So I think you were right to say that transition risk is the one that's nearer term. And in a sense, that's almost the tragedy of horizon. People in our community, in the investment community, will inevitably be focusing on transition risk first. I think those that are really thinking about it, though, will be most worried about the risk of not transitioning at all. That's the physical risk. Litigation, I was looking, again, Grantham Institute, funny enough, is also monitoring the number of legal cases. And there are hundreds now, over 500 different cases that have been going through courts in various jurisdictions, many of which are actually being upheld. So litigation risk, it's definitely taken off. But I don't think it's as material as transition risk. So I guess while starting with the caveat that perhaps physical risk is far more important, today, if you're an investor, you should focus more on transition risk. And that is, of course, transition risk isn't just an oil and gas phenomenon. It's been a risk for any sector in transition. If you owned Kodak when digital cameras were being built, you had transition risk in your portfolio. So transition risk is the risk that we deliver the Paris Agreement so quickly that certain securities have a huge amount of value eroded. And two bits of advice for people watching. I think the greatest source of transition risk in portfolios will be in the illiquids, because they are so much harder to sell. And as the market wakes up to the valuation differential, you will be stuck with the real assets, be they infrastructure or structured finance. They'll be harder to get rid of. Physical risk obviously also applies from a floodplain or a drought and a fire perspective to the real assets. So those would be start with your intangibles portfolio, perhaps. Sorry, start with your real assets portfolio first, and then go to the liquids. I hope that helps.
Thank you. So we've covered disclosure, we've covered risk, and sort of bringing in. Now, I could be wrong here, but I believe, was it the IGCC or one of these organizations? And I think you might have mentioned in one of your previous talk. Again, from an investor's perspective, so bringing it all together, thinking about strategies and solutions. Some would say there are 4 legs to it. There is the integration, or so the risk management piece, of which exclusion could be one extreme part of it. So there's this integration, exclusion. Then there's impact, or investing for impact, and that's where the SDGs come in. And then engagement. Is this a good framework to use for investors thinking about?
Well, it's the framework we use. So yes, I think from a strategic perspective, integration, as we discussed earlier, is exploiting a market inefficiency. So of course you should integrate it anyway, just to price the security better, get more investment insights, and make sure your portfolio is adjusted. So that's climate change as an investment tool, as more investment information. Exclusions, that can be the end of an engagement process, or it could be the beginning of an investment process if you've decided that you want to avoid certain sectors for financial reasons. Sometimes people use it for ethical reasons as well, but I recommend starting with the financial ones. Then there's the kind of inclusions or impact side for certain types of community groups, NGOs, churches, or individuals, or individuals of high net worth, as well as just individuals generally. They might want to make sure their money is invested in solutions to these climate problems, not just because they're likely to make more money, perhaps, but also because they want to make a difference with their capital. But for me, engagement is the biggest of all opportunities and the most important strategy. And we've already talked about engaging with individual companies. I think of that as micro stewardship. I touched earlier on the need for us to engage with the system, governments, macro stewardship, and there's also now the multilateral opportunity. The G7 and the G20, both hosted in Italy and the UK, both co-hosting, those countries co-hosting COP26. What can we as very large financial institutions do to help inform the policymakers in those important forums how to restructure markets, how to capture markets so that they help power a transition towards net zero? For me, that's the biggest question of all, actually, Tech. How do we harness capital markets and their innovative potential to delivering a smooth and just transition on or before 2050 everywhere? So I've tried to kind of go from the specific strategies to the individual security, through to engagement, through to then how do we get the system itself restructured. That I think is a comprehensive and coherent package. We have a role to play at every level.
There is, Steve, there's a question here, in fact, on engagement. So there you go. So at what point does engagement fail and divestment have to be part of your toolkit? And the follow-up question is, at the margin, it raises the company's cost of capital? I mean, it takes a question, does it raise the cost of capital of the company?
So I think this is going to be an annoying answer, but it's an honest one. It will depend on the company in question and what it is that you're asking them to do. Let me give you an example. If you're engaging with a tobacco manufacturer and you're asking them to stop manufacturing cigarettes, that's going to be a really tough challenge. Maybe not impossible in the world of alternative smoking, but that kind of engagement will be very difficult. I think it's similar but different, engaging with the fossil fuel firms and asking them to stop putting new capex into exploration and production of oil and gas. But that is essentially what we now need to do for the net zero strategy from an engagement perspective. So I would say what we try and do, at least, is to be specific about your targets, not just which companies, but exactly what are you asking them to do. Keep a record of when you've asked them to change. And we have a massive contact management system that goes back decades that keeps a track of all the requests for change that we've made. Then over time, you can see whether the company has made any commitments, because you capture those too. And then if it delivers upon them, and this will take years, then you can monitor the effectiveness. If they don't deliver, you can at least track that you've asked the questions. You can know at a point in time when the company was told they needed to do certain things. For example, produce a TCFD report, produce a transition plan, set science-based targets, endorse the Paris Agreement, commit to no new capex in fossil fuels. These are all different levels of request for change that we ask for. And I think of them as the dirty 30. There are 30 companies that we have that we've specifically targeted with that escalating path in mind. And in relation to each one, we therefore have a different point at which we will consider it to have failed. And that consideration isn't just for an individual to take by themselves. The governance group I've referred to before has in mind where are we heading with these individual securities, and what level of commitment have we received, and how convinced are we? So I know that it depends is a annoying answer, but in this case, it really does. It depends on the individual security, what they need to do, and the status of what they've done versus their pledges to you. And you need to track all of that. That is not trivial. And I appreciate a lot of people will be thinking, well, crikey, that's a lot of work. Yeah, it is. And we've got an enormous amount to do to move the global economy onto a net zero basis. We have to get on with it.
A question here, I guess we're getting down to the weeds a bit, and that's in reference to my earlier, I guess, question around, is it even possible to get down to net zero? And if I could compare, there were two, I guess, instances of two comments, and I might list them as an example. There was Mark Carney, and he was taken to task for his comments to Bloomberg, where I believe he's the vice chair of Brookfield. And he made a comment that asset manager is net zero. And he was taken to task by some of the experts, because in that comment, it was in fact alluding to the fact that carbon removals were included in that computation, and hence that's net zero. Whereas on the other hand, in fact, your parent company, Aviva PLC, in fact, has set an even more ambitious target, net zero 2040. And without going into the details, in fact, sitting down over coffee with another ESG person, looking at the graphs, there was this particular graph, and I'll try to describe to this, where from now till 2040, you could see a steady decline of carbon emissions, in the portfolio. But round about the last 6 or 7 years, before 2040, the carbon emissions sort of plateaued, meaning you can go lower, but there's not much lower you can get. And in that particular graph, there was what they call carbon removals, which is in a sense used to offset. And as such, the portfolio is deemed 2040, at least on plan, at that point in time. So I guess the question is, you've got, on the one hand, carbon removals, which is sort of, I guess, accepted as part of the offset as you journey towards 2040, whereas Mark Carney has been taken to task because his other version, avoided emissions, is not counted. I guess it's all confusing here as well.
So I can explain some of this confusion and where it's coming from. Would that help, Jack?
Yeah.
So some of it comes from the political process. So the clean development mechanism within the Kyoto Protocol, which predated the Paris Agreement, talks about carbon trading, and offsets were born, and avoided emissions generated a carbon credit, and there was a value in that. So the industry of carbon abatement emerged, and it was possible to claim, as we have since 2006, that you're carbon neutral, because you're buying these offsets that would come from other people who would have emitted, but have not emitted because you may have enabled them to, for example, we may have bought people stoves, proper stoves, which are much more efficient than just burning in open wood. So burning open wood in in a hut, which is obviously what happens throughout all sorts of developing countries. So that kind of what Mark was referring to was when you produce solar panels, in their case, you're reducing the demand for fossil fuel. So you're avoiding emissions. So that there will be a significant portfolio at Brookfield of solar panels. So that kind of emissions avoided, it's no doubt that's a positive contribution to the climate debate, but it's not net zero because it's not sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequestering it either as a tree in nature-based solutions in peat and other agricultural processes, or actually direct air capture and storage or carbon capture and storage. So think of it like this: if you're kind of thinking of it as a bath, avoided emissions is simply if you're turning the tap on a bit more, you're encouraging someone else to not turn their tap on too. So that's still more CO2, more water going into the bath. Removals is obviously pulling the plug out and sucking the CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequestering it back. And the graph that you're referring to shows our forecasts for some of what we're planning on doing with nature-based solutions and carbon capture and storage. And I've got to be honest with you, over 20 years, it's not possible to be 100% accurate. You're talking about ambitions. And actually, that is an important point. All of these net zero commitments, they are being assembled, apart from some of the binding country ones, they're being delivered on a comply or explain basis. And I think there's going to be an enormous amount of explanation done as we head towards 2030, 2040. And it's going to need to be overseen, which comes back to something you mentioned earlier, Tech. We need to have a multilateral system which properly oversees the structure of capital markets and make sure that these commitments, as well as many others of ESG tilted claims, are properly monitored. So I sympathize, in short, I sympathize with Mark. It's really difficult.
Yeah, and it's a good analogy with the bath and water. We're almost running out of time, but I have a burning question which I must ask you, and it's my favorite, in fact. Steve, you might recall, this must be many, many moons ago. You were featured in a Harvard business case study
yes.
in your, I guess, in early days, Aviva, and like in our case studies, it reflected the dilemma. And I think in the world that we live here, there are dilemmas, there are tensions. How do you make certain calls? And again, for the benefit of our audience, I might just give a bit of a background. So there's this company called Vedanta. It's a diversified mining company, UK, FTSE 100, operations around the world, Australia, India, Zambia, involved in extraction of aluminium, zinc, lead, big company. But it has issues with human rights, other ethical violations, fatalities in work, bribery, negative biodiversity, you name it, they're there. So big company, ESG problems. And I think you will face the problem because Aviva has a holding in this company. And there were two causes of action, I guess. You could engage, and we've talked a lot about that. Or you could say, hang on, it's a market opportunity. This is a bad company. We should short it. Tell us what was going on in your mind and what decision you took.
So this takes me back 10 years, Tech. So Vedanta was focused on by a number, by Amnesty International, Global Witness, and others were bringing it to task because of their practices in Orissa with the Dungria Kon tribal people. And so that was in 2011, as I recall. We decided we had something like a 0.4% of the market cap holding. It's the only company in my entire career from an investment perspective where we've asked for a meeting and they've said no. And we asked repeatedly 3 times, and even though we had 0.4%, they wouldn't meet us. I was staggered. So we were forced to go to the AGM. We raised concern at the AGM. We tabled a report to the board saying why we were concerned about what their practices were like in India. We made 7 specific recommendations about what we were looking for. Over the course of the next few years, actually, we went back to each AGM monitoring whether or not they'd changed. So they felt that we held their feet to the fire. But we were aware, and this is where the Harvard case study picks up, we were aware that there was an approval, or there was at least a permit that had been requested from the Indian, I think it was the Ministry of Forestry. And there was the particular refinery that they were looking to establish would it get approval or not? And the market was expecting it to be approved. And we had reason to believe that it wouldn't be. And it was because these NGOs were causing India some political embarrassment. For example, David Cameron had gone out to do a trip to visit the Indian Prime Minister at the time, and this had come up on Channel 4 News. So the conundrum was, should we then short? And we decided not to, because not for ethical reasons or even financial ones, but because it wasn't clear from a compliance perspective whether our view on this, whether our knowledge, if you like, that it was unlikely to get approved would construe insider trading. So one has to be very careful. If you know information, if particularly you knew something was about to happen, we were right, actually, that the mine didn't go ahead, and the Vedanta was, I think it underperformed something like 44% underperformance against its peer group over the next 18 months. So it's a really material issue. And yeah, I can tell you the hedge fund manager was annoyed, but that was the decision. So it wasn't for ethics, it was for compliance, although you could say those are similar. So that kind of, the case study is available. There's more behind it than that.
Again, these are sort of dilemma that we face. We're sort of running out of time, but there is one question that just popped in, and I thought, look, I'll do justice to this, and it relates again to metrics and portfolio risk measurement. So linking the impacts of climate change back to portfolio risk is tricky, and I think we've covered that. What is your view on the most robust metric that institutional investors can use to explicitly measure portfolio value at risk from the impacts of climate change, beyond scenario analysis, and that uses a lot of assumptions? Right, we've covered that a bit, but what's the most robust that we have currently?
I think we need to do more before we kind of confuse ourselves with implied temperature change within portfolios or average emissions intensity. I think we should revisit how we do the modeling of the valuation in the first place. Fundamentally, are we using the right discount rates? Are we using the right terminal value? Are we assuming the company will continue to grow forever at 2% mean growth rate and fade to the mean? What are we doing to price the externality? What prices are we assuming the carbon will cost the company, and over what trajectory? So if you're looking at value at risk, I would go to DCFs, and I would revisit the valuation of the fundamentals first. Now there are other ways, there are other answers to that. Carbon trading. What would if you for example assumed, as I think we should very soon, $50 price of carbon going up to over $100 globally over the next 3 to 4 years, that I think would be a sensible scenario. Some people will be balking at that, but I think those are the kinds of scenarios. The thing about implied temperature change, which I am a fan of, by the way, to be able to say our stock exchange is 3.5 degrees, but our portfolios are lower, somewhat reassuring, but still a 3-degree portfolio is not good if you're an insurance company and 70% of the world's population are going to have to migrate to 3 degrees, as they will. So I think what we should really be focusing on is when you have this implied temperature change figure, don't just throw your rubbish over the fence. Don't divest, as I've said earlier. Don't vote with your feet, vote with your votes, and don't just focus on your own portfolio and driving down its temperature, because you're simply giving it to others. That's how the secondary market works. Do your engagement. So long answer, revisit DCF, and a number of people will already have glazed over the prospect, but it's important tech. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. And maybe the last question, get back up to the big picture. COP26 was postponed from last year. It will happen in Glasgow in November. What can we expect from COP26? Right.
So I would love to see G7, G20 and COP26 build on each other. The Biden summit on the 22nd of April is going to really set the level of ambition, hopefully a very high bar. We know that Biden is going to come up with a climate transition plan. We already have been told that carbon border adjustment mechanisms, tax borders are already on the table for the G7. At the G20, we've heard that the Green Finance Working Study Group is now going to be a Sustainable Finance Working Group. So I would love, that means they can make policy recommendations. So I'd love to think that they start thinking through What do we use the OECD for, originally created for the Marshall Plan? How do we now use it to deploy carbon finance, climate finance into those developing countries that need it? So I think we'll start to see innovations from the G7 and G20 in the international financial architecture, not just accounting standards and listing rules and so forth, but also revisiting prudential regulation fundamentally, because at the moment TCFD is simply a better thermometer. It's not turning the heat down in the system, and it's not controlling financial stability risk at all. So those are G7 and G20. COP, well, I'd love to see that all the net zero initiatives completed. The moment we've got asset owner, asset manager, and underwriter, I'd love to see banking, particularly investment banking, stock exchanges, credit rating agencies, and investment consultants. We need those initiatives created. Then we need something to bring them all together. I know that's under discussion. And then I believe that we need to then harness those leaders and make sure that their vision is followed fast. And I'd like to think the UN Secretary General will ask all the various UN finance initiatives to ensure that their own principles reflect net zero. It is odd that they don't. PRI, UN Finance Initiative, the Principles for Sustainable Insurance, the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, they don't. The only one that mentions anything like the SDGs and the Paris Agreement is the Principles for Responsible Banking. Tech, there is an enormous amount more that we could talk about for the Paris Agreement and what we're expecting to see in Glasgow. All I would say, for anyone who's interested, we host a call roughly every four to 5 weeks. It's a couple of hours long, a few hundred people come. It's called a Coalition for an International Platform in Climate Finance. And if any of your listeners want to join that coalition and aren't already, they'd be so welcome. They simply need to reach out to me, I'm sure, via your offices or via Twitter, whatever. I'll be very happy to welcome them. Tech, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. This has been fascinating. We'll be sending a lot more notes to the audience, and this is recorded, so again, we can re-listen. Thank you very much for your time, Steve. And we look forward to more changes, more progress. Take care and stay safe.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Tech. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.